Can you say a bit about the genre of the sentence collection to sort of set up, contextualize Peter Lombard's work?
Yes, yes. So the genre, perhaps it's interesting to talk about the meaning of a sentence, a book of sentences. So what is a book of sentences? And the little slightly tired joke that I like to make here is that, well, is not every book a book of sentences? And of course, well, yeah, right. You see, it is a slightly tired joke. Yeah. So what is a sentence? Well, a sententia is an authoritative statement. That's the meaning of the Latin term sententia. So a book of sentences is a collection of authoritative statements systematically arranged to allow the reader to come to grips with authoritative statements from Scripture and from the tradition of the Church, that's to say above all Church Fathers, and among the Church Fathers above all Augustine. These sentences, these sententiae, are arranged, as I already said, in a certain systematic order. Perhaps we'll talk about the kind of systematic order. And then Peter Lombard offers some initial reflections on how statements or sentences that are in tension with each other or appear to contradict each other can be synthesized. So the genre, therefore, is a sentence collection, and the method is a loose form of synthesis. And I'm saying loose for the following reason. You said in your introductory words, you pointed out the success of the Book of Sentences in the history of Western theology. By some accounts or on some measures, one could say that the Book of Sentences is the most successful theology book, just apart from Scripture itself, in Western theology. Why is that? It's because it offers successive generations of readers and commentators a collection of authoritative statements systematically arranged without forcing the reader or the commentator to adopt Peter Lombard's own solutions, not least because often Peter Lombard doesn't give a solution. Sometimes he does, sometimes he does not. And quite frequently, and I find this very charming about the Book of Sentences, really very attractive, quite frequently he will say, now having talked about this truth of the faith, let's say the nature of the incarnation, we realize that the depth of this truth lies beyond the capacity of the human mind, and therefore we now move on. That is to say, there is inbuilt into the Book of Sentences in a kind of discrete way a negative theology, an acknowledgement that God has revealed himself, that God has revealed himself in Scripture, that then the Church Fathers and tradition of the Church elaborates on, builds on Scripture, but that God ultimately remains outside of the possibility of the human mind to comprehend him in any kind of final way. And again, that explains why the Book of Sentences could be used over so many generations. Because when you wrote a commentary on the Book of Sentences or lectured on the Book of Sentences in a medieval university, you didn't really commit yourself to any particular type of theology. Which means that someone like Bonaventure could lecture on the Book of Sentences, someone like St. Thomas Aquinas could lecture on the Book of Sentences, but so could Duns Scotus and Occam, and so could Martin Luther. Martin Luther prepared glosses on the Book of Sentences. So there you can see, and by the way, the Book of Sentences served as a theology textbook in certain universities up to the 17th century. Wow. Into the modern age. And yes. And I would even say, one thing that I always try to do when I teach, philosophy, or now in the position that I have at the University of Kentucky, theology, is I always try to show what the contemporary relevance of a text is that we read. And so I would argue that the type of theology that we see in Peter Lombard's Book of Sentences is still attractive for our own time, because it suggests what, if you will, kind of data you have to take into consideration as you begin to think seriously about a particular aspect of the faith. That's to say, what does Scripture say about this? What do Church Fathers like Augustine say? What do councils say? In our own day, one would say, what does the Second Vatican Council say about this? But then, in many cases, there are different ways in which a truth of the faith can be articulated. And if we were to use a theology textbook of Peter Lombard's kind, we would not commit ourselves from the beginning to Rahner or to Ratzinger or to Henri de Lubac, but we would be challenged to think on the basis of the sources and in light of the sources of the faith, to think for ourselves, and of course, if you think of a classroom setting, together with our students. So you don't get a ready-made theology, you get a theology in nuce, if you will, in a nutshell. More the material to think rather than the result of an already finished thought.